Case dismissed. The gavel slammed down like a hammer crushing hope itself. The old man didn't flinch or speak. He just sat quietly, eyes fixed on his weathered hands folded atop the courtroom's wooden table. 27 years of military service, sacrifice, and pain were boiled down to a single sheet of paper stamped "Denied" in harsh red ink. Behind him, corporate lawyers packed up their briefcases with the cold efficiency of men who had just silenced another inconvenient truth. Their expensive shoes clicked confidently against the marble floors that had silently borne witness to countless quiet defeats, just like this one. Not one glance was spared for the man whose life had been dismissed in an instant. But what nobody in that courtroom knew, not the smug lawyers, not the weary judge, was that the battle was far from over. The old man's defeat was just the beginning of a longer fight, one that wouldn't end in a judge's chambers or a pile of legal documents. Because somewhere across town, a young Navy officer in crisp dress blues was already making his way toward the courthouse, carrying a burden no amount of money could measure: 27 years of debt, honor, and a family's unyielding fight for justice. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our growing community. We're here because these moments matter, and your support helps us bring them to light. The courthouse stood like a monument to bureaucracy at the corner of 5th and Main, its limestone facade weathered by decades of small-town justice and compromise. It was the kind of building that made people whisper when they walked through its doors, not out of reverence, but from the weight of understanding that decisions made here would follow them home. The morning sun barely penetrated the tall windows, casting long shadows across wooden benches that had absorbed more disappointment than celebration. In Courtroom B, the air still carried the tension of unfinished business. Judge Patricia Holloway gathered her papers with the mechanical precision of someone who had delivered too many verdicts to remember them all. She was fair, by most accounts, but practical above all else. At 62, she had learned to separate justice from sentiment, even when it left a bitter taste that no amount of coffee could wash away. Miguel Rodriguez sat alone at the plaintiff's table, his back straight despite the weight of defeat pressing down on his shoulders. At 74, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had once commanded respect, though the years had carved deep lines around his eyes and bent his frame just enough to make him appear fragile to those who didn't know better. His suit was clean but outdated, the same navy blue jacket he had worn to every hearing for the past 18 months. The tie was slightly loose now, a small surrender to the reality that presentation no longer mattered. The case had been simple in its cruelty. Phoenix Benefits Corporation, a military contractor specializing in veteran assistance programs, had systematically denied disability claims while padding their profit margins with money meant for wounded soldiers. Miguel's case was just one of thousands, but he had been the only one stubborn enough to fight back when they reduced his monthly benefits by 60%, claiming his service-related injuries were pre-existing conditions not adequately documented. For 18 months, he had represented himself, armed with nothing but a cardboard box full of medical records and a determination that had carried him through 2 tours in Vietnam. He had filed motions in his careful handwriting, researched legal precedents at the public library, and showed up to every hearing on time, alone, watching corporate lawyers in $1,000 suits argue that his sacrifices weren't worth their promises. The defense team had been thorough in their dismissal. Patricia Chun, lead counsel for Phoenix Benefits, had treated Miguel not with hostility, but with the kind of polite condescension reserved for obstacles that would eventually wear themselves down. She was brilliant, efficient, and completely convinced that good intentions were no match for legal technicalities. Her team had challenged every document, questioned every witness, and systematically dismantled Miguel's case with the precision of a machine designed to protect profit margins. Mr. Rodriguez filed his appeal 17 days past the statutory deadline. Chen had argued in her closing statement, regardless of the merit of his claims, this court is bound by procedural requirements. The law is clear, and sentiment cannot override statute. Judge Holloway had nodded, her expression carefully neutral. She had seen the medical records. She had read about Miguel's service record, his 2 Purple Hearts, his honorable discharge after 27 years of faithful service. She had also seen 1,000 cases where good men got lost in legal technicalities, and she had learned that feelings couldn't rewrite deadlines. The court sympathizes with Mr. Rodriguez's situation, she had said, her voice carrying just enough regret to maintain her humanity while delivering the blow. However, the plaintiff failed to meet the statutory requirements for appeal. Motion denied. Case dismissed. The gavel had fallen with finality that echoed through the nearly empty courtroom. A few spectators, mostly other veterans who had come to show support, shuffled out quietly. The court reporter packed up her equipment. The bailiff checked his watch. Another day, another decision, another file to be archived in a basement that already held too many forgotten fights. Miguel remained seated, not from defiance, but from a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than tiredness. He had spent his pension fighting this case, had mortgaged his small house to pay for document filing fees and expert witness deposits. At 74, he was too old to start over and too proud to ask for help from the few family members who might have cared enough to offer it. Phoenix Benefits had won, as they always did. Their business model was simple. Make the process so complicated, so expensive, and so emotionally draining that most veterans would eventually give up. Those who persisted were met with armies of lawyers and procedural challenges that could stretch cases out for years. It was perfectly legal, technically ethical, and absolutely devastating to the men and women who had trusted them with their futures. Chun and her team were already discussing dinner plans as they packed their briefcases. This had been routine for them, just another day at the office protecting their clients' interests. They would bill their hours, file their reports, and move on to the next case without giving Miguel Rodriguez another thought. He was a number in their system, a problem they had efficiently solved. But as the courtroom emptied, as Judge Holloway prepared to leave her bench, as Miguel sat alone with his defeat, none of them noticed the sound of measured footsteps in the hallway outside. None of them heard the quiet conversation between the bailiff and someone asking directions to Courtroom B. None of them were prepared for what was about to walk through those heavy wooden doors. The young man in the Navy dress uniform paused outside the courtroom, his hand resting on the brass handle as he took a deep breath that carried 23 years of gratitude and determination. Lieutenant Commander James Rodriguez had driven 8 hours straight from Norfolk Naval Base, still wearing the uniform he had put on that morning for his graduation ceremony from the Navy JAG Corps. He had received his law degree and his commission on the same day, but neither felt as important as the phone call that had brought him here. His grandfather hadn't told him about the hearing. Miguel had never asked for help, had never mentioned the legal battles that were draining his savings and his hope. James had found out by accident, through a cousin who worked at the courthouse and recognized the name on the docket. By the time he learned that Miguel was representing himself against a corporation with unlimited resources, the case was already over. Or so everyone thought. James pushed open the courtroom doors and stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention in a way that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with purpose. At 23, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had earned his place through merit rather than privilege. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, but his eyes held something more personal than professional duty. Judge Holloway looked up from her paperwork, surprised by the interruption but not yet annoyed. The bailiff straightened, recognizing military bearing when he saw it. Miguel slowly turned in his chair, confusion giving way to recognition and then to something that looked dangerously close to hope. "Your Honor," James said, his voice clear and respectful but carrying an undertone of absolute determination. "I request permission to address the court regarding the case of Rodriguez versus Phoenix Benefits Corporation." Judge Holloway set down her pen, her judicial instincts immediately alert to the shift in the room's dynamics. "I'm sorry, but this case has been concluded. Are you here in some official capacity?" James walked forward, each step measured and deliberate, until he stood beside his grandfather's chair. He placed one hand gently on Miguel's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes about respect and love and debts that could never be fully repaid. "Your Honor, I am Lieutenant Commander James Rodriguez, United States Navy JAG Corps, recently graduated from Georgetown University Law Center." He reached into his briefcase and produced a set of documents that he placed carefully on the table. "I am requesting to reopen this case and represent Mr. Miguel Rodriguez in his appeal." The silence that followed was electric. Judge Holloway studied the young officer, her experienced eyes taking in the insignia on his collar, the confidence in his posture, and the careful way he had positioned himself not in front of his grandfather but beside him. Patricia Chun, who had been halfway to the door, stopped and slowly turned around. Her team of associates exchanged glances that mixed surprise with the first hint of concern. This wasn't part of their playbook. Individual veterans fighting alone were manageable. Military lawyers with personal investments were an entirely different problem. Commander Rodriguez, Judge Holloway said carefully, while I appreciate your interest in this case, the statutory deadline for appeals has passed. The court lacks jurisdiction to reopen proceedings that have been properly concluded. James nodded respectfully, but his expression didn't change. Your Honor, with respect, I believe there are grounds for reopening based on ineffective assistance of counsel. Mr. Rodriguez was forced to represent himself against a corporation with unlimited legal resources, which constitutes a denial of due process under the Sixth Amendment. Chin stepped forward, her composure intact but her voice carrying a new edge. Your Honor, the plaintiff chose to represent himself. No one forced him to decline legal counsel. James turned to face her, his movement deliberate and controlled. Ms. Chun, are you suggesting that a 74-year-old veteran with no legal training had meaningful access to justice when facing your team of experienced corporate attorneys? I'm suggesting that the law applies equally to everyone, regardless of their background or circumstances, Chen replied, but there was something in her tone that suggested she was no longer as confident in her position. Judge Holloway raised her hand to silence what she could see developing into a more heated exchange. Commander Rodriguez, even if I were inclined to consider your arguments, you would need to demonstrate standing to represent Mr. Rodriguez in this matter. James reached into his briefcase again and produced another set of documents. Your Honor, I have here a power of attorney executed by Mr. Miguel Rodriguez, along with my admission papers to the Virginia State Bar, which I passed last month. I am fully qualified to represent him, and he has authorized me to act on his behalf. Miguel looked up at his grandson with an expression that mixed pride with disbelief. He had raised this young man from the age of 8, after James's parents had died in a car accident that had shattered what was left of their small family. Miguel had used his military pension to pay for private schools, then college, then law school, sacrificing his own comfort to give James opportunities he had never had himself. But James had never forgotten where he came from, or who had made his success possible. Every scholarship he had earned, every honor he had received, every step toward his commission had been motivated by a desire to honor the man who had given up everything to raise him. And now, finally, he had the tools to fight back. Judge Holloway reviewed the documents, her expression carefully neutral, but her mind clearly working through the implications. She had been on the bench for 15 years, and she had developed an instinct for cases that were about to become more complicated than they appeared. Ms. Chun, she said finally, does your client have any objection to allowing new counsel to review the case file? Chun conferred quickly with her associates, their whispered conversation growing more intense as they realized the position they were in. Phoenix Benefits had built their business model on the assumption that individual veterans wouldn't have the resources to mount effective challenges. A military lawyer with personal motivation and unlimited time was not something their algorithms had accounted for. Your Honor, Chin said finally, while we don't object to Mr. Rodriguez obtaining legal representation, we would argue that the statutory deadlines still apply regardless of who is representing him. James stepped forward again, his voice still respectful, but now carrying the authority of someone who had spent the last 3 years studying exactly this kind of case. Your Honor, I would like to present evidence that Phoenix Benefits Corporation engaged in systematic fraud designed specifically to deny benefits to veterans who lack the resources to fight back. The statute of limitations is told when fraud is involved, and I believe we can demonstrate a pattern of deliberate deception that goes far beyond Mr. Rodriguez's individual case. The courtroom atmosphere changed completely. What had been a routine dismissal was now becoming something much larger and more dangerous. Chin's team was no longer discussing dinner plans. They were calculating exposure, liability, and the potential for a case that could unravel their client's entire business model. Judge Holloway looked at the young officer standing beside his grandfather. then at the corporate lawyers who were suddenly very interested in their phones and files. She had presided over enough cases to recognize the moment when justice and law converged in a way that would make headlines. "I'm going to grant a 30-day continuance," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of a decision that everyone knew would change everything. "Commander Rodriguez, you have 30 days to file your motions and present your evidence. Ms. Chun, I suggest you use that time to review your client's policies very carefully." She stood, and the bailiff called for all to rise. But the formal conclusion of the hearing felt more like the beginning of something than an ending. As Judge Holloway left the bench, James turned to his grandfather and helped him to his feet. Miguel's eyes were bright with tears he refused to shed in public, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Mijo, you didn't have to do this. This isn't your fight." James looked at the man who had sacrificed everything to give him a future, then at the corporate lawyers who were hurriedly packing their briefcases and making phone calls that would keep them busy late into the night. "Abuelo," he said quietly, using the Spanish word that carried all the love and respect of their shared history. "You fought for this country for 27 years. Then you fought for me for 23 more. Now it's my turn to fight for you." As they walked out of the courtroom together, grandfather and grandson, veteran and officer, the abandoned and the advocate, Phoenix Benefits Corporation was about to learn that some debts transcend statute of limitations, and some fights are too important to lose. The 30 days that followed transformed not just Miguel's case, but the entire landscape of veteran advocacy law. James worked 18-hour days from his grandfather's kitchen table, surrounded by boxes of documents that told a story of systematic exploitation spanning nearly a decade. He had taken leave from his first Navy assignment, citing family emergency, but what he was really doing was conducting the kind of detailed investigation that only someone with unlimited motivation and newly acquired legal expertise could manage. The evidence was overwhelming once someone knew how to look for it. Phoenix Benefits had developed algorithms designed to automatically deny claims based on technicalities rather than merit. They had hired former military personnel to give their company credibility while training their staff to exploit veterans' trust and unfamiliarity with legal procedures. Most damaging of all, they had kept detailed records of their success rates, celebrating internally each time they managed to deny benefits to someone who deserved them. James filed a motion for class action status, representing not just his grandfather, but thousands of veterans who had been similarly defrauded. He requested damages that would not only compensate victims, but fundamentally alter Phoenix Benefits' ability to continue their predatory practices. Most importantly, he made sure that every major news outlet in the region knew exactly what was happening and why. The second hearing drew a packed courtroom. Veterans organizations sent representatives. Legal aid societies offered support. Local news crews set up cameras in the hallway. What had begun as one old man's lonely fight had become a symbol of something much larger. Patricia Chun arrived with a team twice the size of her original group, but their confidence had been replaced by the grim determination of lawyers who knew they were fighting to save their client from financial ruin. Phoenix Benefits had already begun quietly settling similar cases across the country, hoping to avoid the precedent that a loss in Judge Holloway's courtroom would establish. Judge Holloway entered to a courtroom that buzzed with anticipation. She had spent the previous 30 days reviewing James's evidence, consulting with colleagues, and preparing for what she knew would be one of the most important decisions of her career. "Commander Rodriguez," she began, "please present your case." James rose, his uniform replaced today by a simple dark suit that made him look older and more serious. But when he spoke, his voice carried the same controlled intensity that had first commanded the court's attention. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Phoenix Benefits Corporation has defrauded the United States government and thousands of military veterans through a systematic scheme designed to deny legitimate claims while maximizing profit. They have stolen not just money, but dignity, hope, and faith in the system these men and women serve to protect." For the next 4 hours, James methodically presented a case that was devastating in its thoroughness. He called expert witnesses who explained how Phoenix Benefits' denial algorithms worked. He presented internal emails celebrating successful denials of legitimate claims. He showed financial documents proving that the company's entire business model depended on keeping money that rightfully belonged to veterans. But the most powerful moment came when he called Miguel to testify. The old man walked slowly to the witness stand, his back straight despite the weight of his years. When James asked him to explain what his military service had meant to him, Miguel's voice was quiet but clear. I believed that if I served my country faithfully, my country would take care of me when I needed help. That's not asking for charity. That's asking for what was promised, what was earned. James nodded, then asked the question that would define the case. Abuelo, if you had known that Phoenix Benefits was systematically defrauding veterans, would you have fought this battle alone for 18 months? Miguel looked directly at the Phoenix Benefits legal team, then at Judge Holloway, then at his grandson who had given up everything to stand beside him. No, Mijo. I would have called you on day one. The courtroom was completely silent. Chin made no objection. There was nothing to object to except the truth. Judge Holloway recessed for deliberation, but everyone knew the outcome was no longer in doubt. The evidence was too clear, the moral case too compelling, and the legal precedent too important to ignore. When court reconvened 2 hours later, Judge Holloway's decision was swift and comprehensive. She granted class action status. She awarded full damages to Miguel Rodriguez and ordered Phoenix Benefits to restore his benefits immediately. Most importantly, she issued an injunction requiring the company to overhaul their entire claims process under court supervision. This court finds that Phoenix Benefits Corporation engaged in systematic fraud designed to exploit the very people who sacrificed to defend our freedoms, she announced. Such conduct is not only illegal, but morally reprehensible and will not be tolerated in this jurisdiction. The gavel came down not with the hollow finality of defeat, but with the solid ring of justice served. This time, when Miguel Rodriguez walked out of the courthouse, he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by other veterans whose cases would now be reviewed, by reporters who would ensure the story reached every corner of the country, and by his grandson, who had proven that some fights are worth everything. Outside, James loosened his tie and looked at his grandfather with a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. The case was won, but the work was just beginning. Phoenix Benefits would appeal, other companies would need investigating, and thousands of veterans would need advocates who understood their struggles. You know, this means I'll be fighting these cases for the rest of my career, James said. Miguel smiled, the first genuine smile he had worn in months. Good. Someone should. As they walked toward Miguel's old pickup truck, a reporter approached asking for a comment. James was about to decline when his grandfather stopped him. Tell them, Miguel said quietly, that sometimes the system works, but only when good people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. James nodded and turned to the camera. My grandfather taught me that we don't fight because we hate what's in front of us. We fight because we love what's behind us. Today, loved one. Sometimes justice comes not from grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but from the simple decision to refuse to abandon those who once refused to abandon us. Miguel Rodriguez had served his country for 27 years, then spent 23 more years serving his grandson. When the moment came for that investment to pay dividends, it returned not just money or benefits, but something more precious. Proof that sacrifice is never forgotten by those who understand its true value. Lieutenant Commander James Rodriguez could have chosen any specialty in the Navy JAG Corps. He could have pursued corporate law, international relations, or criminal justice. Instead, he chose to become an advocate for veterans' rights, inspired by an old man who had fought alone until someone finally fought back. Phoenix Benefits Corporation eventually paid over $40 million in settlements and restructured their entire operation under federal oversight. They never admitted wrongdoing, but they never again systematically denied legitimate claims from the men and women who had earned them through service and sacrifice. And in a small house at the edge of town, an old veteran sleeps a little easier knowing that his grandson carries forward not just his name, but his values. Miguel Rodriguez had raised a boy to be a man, and that man had chosen to become exactly the kind of person his grandfather had always been, someone who fights for what's right, regardless of the cost. The case was closed, but the story continues. Because sometimes the most powerful victories come not from defeating enemies, but from refusing to let the people we love fight their battles alone. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who sacrificed quietly, loved unconditionally, and inspired greatness through their example? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their influence shaped who you became. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our mission of bringing these powerful human moments to light. We'll see you in the next one.